Told the story about Kerry and Obama and how Kerry was invited to join the One Belt One Road initiative. I'd never heard that story before.
Yeah,
we'd be in a very different position today if Obama
by the way,
yes.
Kerry goes on to say, you know, in life you have these missed opportunities. It's the single biggest missed opportunity in my life, politically.
I mean, it certainly has completely reshaped the international development world. The World Bank, the IMF are now second fiddles, really, to that effort.
大家好，我是小满。今天给大家带来的是高盛前总裁桑顿在德克萨斯大学的一段访谈。他从2003年开始就在清华大学全球领导力项目担任教授和主任，了解很多不为人知的故事。就像片头他提到，习主席竟然向前美国国务卿克里发出邀请，加入一带一路倡议。可惜这件影响世界格局的大事，连送上奥巴马办公桌上的机会都没有。除此之外，桑顿对中国的见解也是小满这么久以来觉得最为透彻的。让我们来一起听听。
So, one of the things then that I think it would be helpful for us to understand is what are the policies that he's implemented and why. And you mentioned the number of countries that have remained neutral with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. One can't but wonder how much the One Belt, One Road initiatives, which supported the trade both within Asia and China's connection to natural resources and the rest of the world economy through this initiative, have played a role in that outcome. Can you talk about what you see as the importance of what that initiative looks like?
Well, One Belt, One Road is a perfect example of something. And I didn't know this until I was told this by John Kerry. So John Kerry told me that in, I think it was 2013, he was the senior American at one of these international meetings that Obama could not attend for one reason or another. And so he was the person who took the meeting with Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping in that meeting said to John Kerry, by the way, let me tell you about something I'm thinking about. And he laid out the One Belt, One Road. And Kerry said to him, oh, that's very interesting. Why don't we do this together? And Xi Jinping says, that's a great idea. Let's do this together. And Kerry came back to Washington, and he said before he got off the plane, the Treasury Mandarin said, cut his legs off, and there was no chance it was going to happen. So it never got to Obama's desk as kind of a strategic question. But I tell you that story because if you were reading today the characterization of One Belt, One Road, you would think this was some kind of malevolent tactic to get control of the world on the part of the Chinese, which it is not. It is exactly what it's said, what they say it is, which is to extend a model of development into as many countries as it wanted, who desperately need it. And when I talked earlier about Chinese modernization that I attended this last Monday, so Chinese modernization, I won't go into all the details, but there basically are 5 central characteristics of it, one of which is a peaceful world. Second one of which is common prosperity. Third one of which is harmony between man and nature. So the foreign minister went through this whole thing, and then there were 5 of us asked to comment on it. And I said, in my comments, I said, listen, those of us who have ever run anything know, plans are one thing, execution is another. Execution is the whole thing. So my advice to you, the Chinese, would be, if you're going to hold yourself out as believing in these things, I mean, who's against any of these things? Who's against world peace? Who's against harmony between man and nature? Who's against common prosperity? Nobody. 10 out of 10 people. There's nobody in this room who's going to be against any of these things. So that's not the issue. The issue is, are you actually going to do what you say you do? And if you don't, you're going to suffer the same negative blowback that countries like the United States get when they were seen as being hypocritical. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, which is extremely important, and a point I want to make to all of you, which I made to the Chinese till I'm blue in the face very unsuccessfully, which is, when I first started spending a lot of time in China was I was chairman of Goldman Sachs Asia in the mid-90s into 2000. At a point in time when the Chinese system was just starting to open up, and they were just starting to put state-owned enterprises into Western markets. And Zhuangzi was the premier, or vice premier, then premier. And he was a very unusual person. And he really cared about getting this right. And I happened to be there, and I was very senior. So I was in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to give him advice in a way that will probably never occur again, because the Chinese were so in need of the advice. But one thing that struck me about them was the Chinese leadership, on almost every topic, not every topic, but almost every topic, was systematically open in the following sense. They started with the premise there's somebody in the world who knows this topic better than we do. Let's get that somebody to Beijing. Let's drain his brain. Let's study what he had to say, see if it applies to us, refine it and customize for our circumstance, and then execute. And they did this time after time after time, which is why back in those days you would have seen both Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji routinely meeting with Western CEOs, Western superb academics, Nobel Prize winners and so forth, Western head of NGOs. They met with them routinely, one-on-one, because they knew they were getting very high quality information coming in from people who didn't work for them, and good information was coming back the other way. That started to stop a few years ago. That's another topic. But my point is systematically open, except I said to them, listen, one topic you missed, which is the English language dominates the world's communication channels. And you recognize that. You literally don't participate in them at all. So the Chinese story, as it were, is told by people who are not Chinese. And guess what? They don't know the story as well. They don't tell it as well. And so it's entirely absent. And until you start to get into those channels, you're going to be at a big, big disadvantage. So when you talk about Chinese modernization, coming back to that, if you believe it, number one, you've got to deliver on it. And number two, you've got to communicate it in such a way that the external world, particularly the English language world, takes it in and believes it. And right now you're failing miserably on that count. And until that gets corrected, it's never going to solve that problem.
So one of the things I think most Americans were taught when they learned about China was that it is a communist, originally Marxist form of government and society. But one of the things that many of us have missed is how not just embracing of markets China has been, but how dominant China has become at capitalism in its own flavor of capitalism in terms of state-owned enterprises and allowing for other kinds of free market operations. And the One Belt, One Road initiative is in many ways an expression of that. The incredible trade integration and market integration with the U.S. is another expression of that. Can you talk about how that transformation has happened and how we missed it and what it means for China in particular?
Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, I just want to read you one quick thing. This, by the way, another one of my pet peeves is that last November I was having breakfast in New York with a very senior Chinese official, just one-on-one with a note-taker. And in the first 5 minutes, the official said to me, it's so frustrating to us that senior Americans never read anything that we put out. Instead, what they do is they listen to so-called experts, Western experts, who interpret our documents for these, let's say, the senior people in this country. Mm-hmm. And he gave a specific example. He said, for example, Kevin Rudd, this is him talking. Kevin Rudd, who I know very well. He's a good guy. He knows China quite well. Again, Kevin Rudd's got a whole theory about what we're doing now. And a lot of people listen to him. He said, the problem is Kevin Rudd's wrong. And I don't know how to correct that. And when he said that, I said, I recognize exactly what you're saying. It relates to what I was just saying a minute ago. But in addition to which, here I've got a book, for example, written by a senior Chinese, comparing the Warring States period in China with ancient Greece. So a frustration of mine is, as much as I know or don't know about China, and I know that an outsider to a culture can never be an insider. The most you can ever hope to be is kind of a synthetic insider by building relationships with people. But one thing I know after all these years is that as much as I think I know on something, if I don't test it with a close Chinese friend, I'm going to be off. Sometimes a little bit and sometimes a lot. And so I tried as much as I can to read things that the Chinese themselves actually write. And by the way, this is an aside, with respect to the Chinese government, when they say they're going to do something, chances are very high they're going to do it. And in contrast, for example, to our State of the Union, which is basically a speech about the future and about hope, the Chinese have a thing they call the equivalent in China is the Chinese work report, which tells you exactly what they actually did for real and what they're going to do for real. It's a completely different document. All right. Now, I just want to read you one thing here, though, that sort of captures, I think, a very good sentiment. Bear with me here one second. Okay, here we are. The power configuration in the current world should not be defined as competition between China and the United States for hegemony. Rather, we witness a shift from the situation in which a single civilization dominated the globe to common prosperity of diverse civilizations. What China has inaugurated is not a Chinese century, but a century of diverse civilizations, a new era in which there will no longer be a single civilizational hegemon. And that's exactly the way the Chinese see it. As opposed to, Joe Biden says this is the century of democracies versus autocracies. Some of the funnier, more clever Chinese will say, no, it's the plutocracy versus the meritocracy. Which gets to the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, the best way to think about that is the Chinese Communist Party is essentially the meritocratic elite. In the same way that if you look back through Chinese history, there was an emperor, and then there was the Mandarin class running the country. That's essentially what you have at the moment. And you don't get into the Chinese Communist Party if you're not very able. You don't get to Tsinghua University if you're not very able. 10 million kids a year take the national examinations to go to university. The top 3,000 of those go to Tsinghua University. 3,000 get admitted and 3,000 go. And so, and Tsinghua University accounts for 50% of the leadership of the country. So that the examination-based culture, which has existed for 2,000 years, still exists, and essentially, that's what drives the input into all these institutions. And so to put it in the vernacular, if you get to the top of the Chinese system, there's no chance you're not very smart and very able. And the only institution in this country, which is, to me, is at all like it, and when I tell them this, it drives them crazy, the only institution in this country that's at all like the Chinese Communist Party is the U.S. military. Which is to say that if you and I were 18 years old and we went to West Point together, and we went in the military and we stayed in the military, one day we're 4-star generals, we've known each other for, whatever it is, 40 years, and we're sitting around the same table. That's the Chinese system. And so they know each other intimately. They've had real jobs. They failed or they succeeded. If they succeeded, they went ahead. If they failed, they failed. And like all big organizations, there, of course, is plenty of rough justice and infighting and all the rest of it that goes on in every corporation in the United States and anywhere else. But that's basically the system. So I think the word communist kind of gets into the mental way of Americans understanding what you're dealing with. It's not a communist system, period. Which doesn't mean they don't have, when they talk about common prosperity, for example, you might say that's the equivalent of trying to fix income inequality that we would talk about. But the other day, another Chinese was saying to me the capitalist system is essentially a divide and conquer system. The Chinese modernization is a unifying system. And so Xi Jinping, to go back to him, he is determined, although they haven't figured out how to do this yet, that common prosperity is for real. They're proud of the fact they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Well, that's the most ever in history by a long, long way. And they're proud of that. And they think those people ought to continue to advance. And that this, these big, big differences between the wealthy and the poor is too much. And that's why you see them sort of cracking down now on some of that.
桑顿这番话表面上是在吐槽美国当年因为官僚内斗错失了加入一带一路的惊天良机，又或者是恨铁不成钢的批评中国不会在英语舆论场里讲故事，但本质上他是在照出一面极其残酷的镜子。当今大国博弈的症结根本不是什么自由与集权的烂俗戏码，而是傲慢的闭门造车与极致的实用主义之间的生死对决。历史的周期率向来冷酷无情，任何一个超级大国一旦陷入了傲慢的信息茧房，开始用意识形态的滤镜去裁剪现实，用所谓专家的二创去代替对真实对手的底层研究，它的衰退就已经不可逆转了。系统论告诉我们，一个不断吸收外部信息，懂得把高人请来榨干智慧的系统，永远会战胜一个自我封闭、党同伐异的系统。资本主义的本质是分化与统治，而桑顿口中中国正在追求的却是凝聚与共识。这不是简单的制度之争，这是两种文明演进路径、两种资源分配底层逻辑的史诗级碰撞。所以当傲慢的霸主还在用共产主义这种过时的冷战标签来麻痹自己的时候，另一个庞然大物早就在用最精英的军营式管理、最内卷的选拔机制去兑现共同富裕的宏大叙事了。